As part of Governor Kathy Hochul's updated budget plans this year, an additional $150 million in state funds is poised to flow to municipalities outside of New York City. But the additional dollars won't make up for all of the budget holes across upstate New York cities. For more on this landscape, we're joined in the Capitol Press Room studio by Barbara Van Epps, the Executive Director for the New York Conference of Mayors. Thanks for visiting us in the studio, Barbara.
Thanks for having me.
So can you walk the listeners through the role the state traditionally plays in funding local municipal budgets, whether it is cities or towns, for example?
Sure. So the problem with the way the state funds us now is that we get a very small amount of unrestricted aid, which is essentially revenue sharing, also referred to as AIM funding. And in past years, the state's tried to be generous with that funding, but the problem is that as that has remained flat over the last several years and costs continue to grow, it has not been able to serve the purpose that revenue sharing was originally created for, which was to allow municipalities to fund the municipal services that they provide to the residents without having to overburden their property taxpayers. So we are very happy that the governor has proposed, and the Senate Assembly in their own one-house budgets, have proposed to increase that unrestricted aid to local governments.
So thinking about the historical deployment of the AIM funding, as it's known here in Planet Albany, is this one of those signs of state support that has never been the same since the Great Recession? Is it something that was changed demonstrably during the 11 years of Governor Andrew Cuomo? What has the ebb and flow of this looked like?
There have been a lot of changes since the program was first created. So, it started back in the 1950s. In the 1970s, it was truly supposed to be a form of revenue sharing where a certain percentage of personal income tax, the state personal income tax, was supposed to flow to municipalities. That formula was pretty much not withstood even before it was implemented. And then since then, it has remained relatively flat, but additional programs were created to deal with distressed municipalities. And when AIM was created back in the early 2000s, it was a culmination. They essentially consolidated 6 programs into one. So people complain about the inequities, and clearly there are inequities because of that consolidation of the programming. So there are a lot of municipalities that think they deserve more, and that is probably true. But because of the way it kind of evolved over the years, it's very difficult to find a formula and to defend a formula. So people talk about, let's look at the formula to address these inequities. That's going to be very difficult to do because there is no clear-cut formula because of this conglomerate of 6 programs into one.
Well, that was going to be my next question. The idea of a formula is something that sounds nice. It sounds like it's one of those things that can ensure that money isn't necessarily going to the preferred leaders or the preferred municipalities. But in practice, are we actually having this objective formula that's distributing dollars, or are people putting their fingers on the scale, so to speak?
I tend to agree that there isn't really a formula for the reasons I said. And so increases and decreases for the last several years have been just across the board. So they're not taking into account need. They're not taking into account unique circumstances of, cities versus villages or towns versus counties. And so those things, you want a formula that you are able to defend, that you are able to, that makes sense. And right now, that really doesn't exist. But the problem is if you go and try to recreate this entire program, you're going to have winners and losers.
Sure.
And we don't want to have winners and losers. So we're all about, yes, let's look at a better way, perhaps, to allocate this funding, but not while you're cutting funding to some municipalities in exchange for giving more to others.
So as I mentioned at the top, when the governor unveiled her budget amendments about 30 days after her budget proposal, there was an additional $150 million of financial assistance for municipalities outside of New York City with a focus on relieving some immediate fiscal stress. For context, how does $150 million compare to the aid and incentives that municipalities are already expecting, kind of traditionally?
So for we get $750 million in the AIM program, and that's the number that was flat for 15 years until 2 years ago when they did this additional $50 million in temporary municipal assistance. Clearly, given that name, it was intended to be temporary. So we are very grateful that they have continued that $50 million, and even more grateful that the governor has decided that she wanted to increase that to $150 million, as, like I said, the Senate and Assembly have agreed with that proposal, and in certain instances have added more. Is it enough? I mean, anyone will tell you, the schools will tell you, anybody who gets funded by the budget, it's never enough, but we certainly appreciate the increase. And what we're trying to do is, back to that original intent of the revenue sharing program, we need predictable funding that we can use to fund our essential municipal services, the cost of which are increasing every year. Mm-hmm. So we just want a predictable funding stream to help us do that and to relieve the burden on the property taxpayers, because that's where we have to go when we have gaps in our budget. When we can't fund our services, we have to turn to the property tax, because that's the only source of revenue we have any control over.
Well, you speak to the issue of predictability, and earlier we talked about how there's a formula but not really a formula. One of the things I was struck by in the governor's decision to spend additional money was the way it's being split up. It's not necessarily, hey, we're just going to add this money into the existing pool and split it up based on the formula. It's $10 million for Rochester, $10 million for Syracuse, $10 million for Yonkers, and it speaks to me, at least again, of that finger on the scale. I mean, when you think about how the governor is planning to direct this additional money, including, I think, $40 million in direct aid for Buffalo, does it seem like it is going where it's most needed? And you think, yes, the governor has identified with the eventual sign-off of the legislature the places where this should go, or does this just scream of, well, this is where there's a Democratic base, here's an influential lawmaker? I mean, how do you think about the distribution?
Well, again, when there is some formula, when I say formula-driven, there is the increases that they propose, the $150 million that everyone has agreed to, would be given to every municipality, including those big cities, but they're going to be capped at $5 million. Then there's that additional bullet aid that you're referring to that goes to specific cities. I would hope it's not based on politics and more based on need. I mean, clearly the larger cities have a lot more infrastructure to deal with, a lot more people below the poverty line, a lot more crime. So their needs, clearly, they have more needs than maybe some of our smaller communities. So I would assume that's what they're basing those targeted pots of aid on.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you. For listeners just joining us, this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and I'm David Lombardo, and we're speaking with Barbara Van Epps, the Executive Director for the New York Conference of Mayors. One of the things we often hear from municipalities is that a lot of their costs are out of their control, especially as the drumbeat the counties are always beating. Is that the same complaint that your members have, that the Conference of Mayors is dealing with, the idea of the state passing down all sorts of mandates and then not passing down the same amount of funding for those mandates?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly unfunded mandates that we deal with every day. I would argue that the counties, certainly because they are more of an arm when it comes to the social services and health programs, they have more to deal with in terms of mandates that are passed along. But it's clearly, local governments across all different classes have state mandates that they have to deal with. And again, that's where our problem lies, because we don't have that flexibility to raise the revenue to offset that. We are very limited in terms of our non-property tax revenue sources.
Well, do you feel like the mandates outstrip the revenue you're getting?
Right now, I mean, again, because we were held flat for so long, we've lost money over the years. Clearly, that $715 we get hasn't been enough because it was flat for 15 years.
Right, doesn't keep up with inflation, for example.
100%. And so I would argue if you did a side-by-side, yes, probably there are, the costs that are imposed on us outweigh the benefits that we get in unrestricted aid.
Well, at the same time, we're having this conversation about the support for municipalities from the state. State policymakers are considering the idea of sweetening the pensions for public employees all across New York, and the changes will have increased costs for their employers, which could be a local government, it could be a school district, it could be the state. How are you thinking about the potential for additional costs as a result of these pension sweeteners? Do you see this as an important step for your recruitment and retention, and thus you're happy to potentially shoulder this additional cost, or are you worried about these potential changes?
So it's really a combination of both. So we clearly understand that the issues concerning recruitment and retention because we're feeling it at the local level as well. And we're trying to address that in a number of different ways. However, at the same time, this cost that they're projecting, and again, part of the concern we have is the uncertainty. We haven't seen any language. We haven't seen a fiscal impact. So when I've been asked about this for the last couple of weeks, I've said, I can't give you my opinion yet or my opinion on behalf of our members because we don't know what the cost truly is. Now that they're starting to flesh things out a little and we're seeing numbers, we are absolutely concerned about the cost. And in the past, when they did the Tier 6 initially, they passed a section of the law that says the state is going to have to pay for pension sweeteners going forward. And clearly that is not, doesn't look like that's going to be the case this year. So
are you reminding people of that as you make visits to legislative offices?
We are trying to. We are absolutely trying to. I mean, we've joined forces with the NIAT, the Association of Towns, and ISAC, the Association of Counties, and we've come together and said we are not opposed to reforming Tier 6, but we are very concerned about the cost, and we want the state to abide by the law that they passed back when Tier 6 was first implemented.
And this conversation, though, is not being had in a vacuum because there have been changes to the pension structure in recent years. Have you felt the cost of those changes as well?
We have. We have. The changes that they did last time, 2 years ago, we did see an increase in costs as a result of that. Probably not as much as we could see if the proposed changes that they're talking about actually go through. But in that, when they did those changes, they did notwithstand that section of law that says the state would have to pay for them. So obviously we think that could be the case again going forward. And like I said, we are not opposed to reforms. We think they certainly have to be considered. We love to be part of that conversation. We also think there's other ways you can sweeten the pie or sweeten the pot for new employees or employees in general. Look at, better starting salaries, look at bonuses, look at more flexible work schedules. I mean, I don't know if the younger generation is as concerned about their pension as they are work-life balance or how much money they're going to have, at the end of the week. So I think there's other ways of looking at it rather than saddling the state and local governments with these long-term costs that are not going to go away if they make these changes.
Well, you just highlighted the thing that always comes to my mind, which is the public pension is still the best game in town when it comes to secure retirement. And if I'm a city looking to hire, say, a DPW worker, I don't know exactly what that person is expecting to find in the private sector. But do you feel like cities have enough flexibility in their budgets to, say, offer more appealing starting salaries, for example?
I think they would have to do a cost-benefit analysis. It's like the long-term costs that you're going to be saddled with forever. Perhaps you have a little bit of a surplus in a particular year. So you can say, hey, this year we're going to give bonuses, or this year we're going to, increase starting salaries a little bit, or do things that are within the constraints of your budget that these local officials know better than anyone, rather than imposing these costs on them that we don't really have a good handle on, and also are going to be long-term. For years, going forward, they are always going to be saddled with those costs. And I think they just need to have the flexibility to do what they need to do at the local level and still make sure they can do what they need to do to recruit and retain good employees.
Well, we've been speaking with Barbara Van Epps. She's the Executive Director for the New York Conference of Mayors. Barbara, thanks for visiting us in the studio.
Thanks for having me.
Support for the Capitol Press Room is provided in part by the Lawsuit Reform Alliance of New York. Fraud and lawsuit abuse impact car insurance costs for New Yorkers. Reforms are being proposed to mitigate their impact. Information on these reforms is available at keepnewyorkaffordable.org.